Hello everybody, I hope you're having a great day. Welcome to another salvage video where I'm going to take a potentially scrap PC and see if I can return it to its former glory. This is yet another PC that I've picked up from the Indian classified website olx.in, and I'm hoping that this one will be a quick fix. This machine was advertised as a Pentium 3 PC, but nothing else is known about it really. When I went to pick it up, the owner showed me that it did power on and tried to boot to Windows XP, but never quite got there. I'm guessing that it just needs Windows reinstalling and is otherwise working, but it definitely needs a cosmetic tune-up, so let's crack on with that first. The first thing I noticed that I wasn't expecting was that this machine has an AT form factor motherboard. Honestly, I didn't realise that AT was still in use by the time Pentium 3 rolled around. I thought we'd all moved to ATX by that point. It doesn't really matter, other than I need an adapter to plug in a later PS2 keyboard, as I don't own a keyboard with this older style of connector. It looked like all of the ports are on expansion cards, which is a little weird, as by this point I thought most of this connectivity was built into motherboards rather than relying on expansion cards. Moving round to the side of the case, and who could miss this huge green sticker emblazoned across the chassis? The same green alien motif was also applied to the monitor and to the front of the case. After a little research, it turns out that this branding is from Netcracker, an India-based dial-up internet service provider. So I'm guessing this machine is from an internet cafe or a Netcracker customer's house in the late 90s. Inside the machine, we can see that actually most of the expansion ports at the back are connected to the motherboard via ribbon cables and not via expansion boards, which is good because it means we have more PCI slots available and even a lonely ISA slot down at the bottom. The only things plugged into the expansion slots are the USB ports, modem, Ethernet card and sound card. The network card is a compact unit and predates the rest of this machine, so it was probably a later addition when the original owner moved from dial-up to Ethernet-based internet. The VIA USB card was certainly a later addition, seeing as it's USB 2.0 and is date stamped 2006 on the back. The sound card is a cheap AC97 card from Intex, and the modem has no real identifying marks, but it's pretty useless in 2022 anyway, and probably won't be going back into this build. With all that stuff out of the way, we can get our first glance at the motherboard, and it looks to be in pretty reasonable condition. It's model number 6VPLE1 from Lucky Star and can take either an Intel Celeron or Pentium 3 or a Cyrix 3 processor. It uses standard PC133 SD RAM, of which we have a total of 256MB across 2 sticks. You've also got dual IDE channels and a floppy controller on board, as you'd expect. In terms of drives, we've got a typically beige Samsung CD drive from April 2001. This was probably the original drive for this machine, but it wasn't connected to the motherboard, so I'm wondering if it even works, or whether the previous owner was just too lazy to remove it. We've also got a Sony CD-RW/DVD combo drive, which looks like a later edition given it wasn't made until 2006 and has a black bezel rather than beige. Beneath both of these drives we have a standard 3.5-inch floppy drive, and beneath that lies a 20GB IDE hard disk from Samsung. I noticed that most of the internals had signatures and dates etched on them in permanent marker, and they date the system at May 2001, with some later additions like the sound card and USB card. It's not the dirtiest machine I've worked on lately. It looks like it's been kept in a humidity controlled environment, so other than a fair bit of dust there wasn't much to clean off. The chassis is also zinc plated, so there's not much rust to speak of, just a little bit of discoloration. The various internal components all got wiped down and cleaned with isopropyl alcohol and mostly came up looking really nice. A few of the expansion cards and ports had some corrosion where they'd been exposed a lot more to high humidity, but a dish scouring pad and some alcohol got them all looking a lot better. The inside of the chassis just got hoovered out and then cleaned with some wet wipes and isopropyl alcohol, and ended up looking pretty good other than the odd tan line. The painted steel shroud got a good soak in the bath and a good scrub to try and get the rest of the sticker off. This took an absolute age and needed plenty of repeat treatments of glass cleaner, isopropyl alcohol, and even this motorcycle clean that I've used to good effect before. In the end, I ended up just soaking it in some hot water for a few hours and eventually it came off completely. I've ended up with this weird two-tone effect where the sticker used to be. I'm assuming this is because the paint has been damaged somewhat by UV light over the years, whereas the areas that were covered aren't that bad. The front panel for the case needed a similar treatment, but before I could do that, I needed to remove the LED indicators and the reset button. The button was no issue at all, but the LEDs were held in place with glue, so I had to cut them loose. Then it was time to get the front panel in the bath and get scrubbing, with some expert help to get the worst of the grime and sticker residue off. She went to town with her mum's toothbrush, and eventually it was clean enough to eat your dinner off of. Once it was clean, you could clearly see where the plastic had yellowed in places, so I decided to give it a retro bright treatment. My method of doing this is to submerge parts in a solution made of 3 parts water and 1 part hydrogen peroxide solution, which is a 12% solution. This particular solution also contains trace amounts of silver as it's designed for food preparation, but that doesn't play a part in this process and it isn't required for the retrobrighting to work. For parts this size, I use this stainless steel roasting tin. On hot days I find this warms up really quickly and the reflectiveness in the material helps get an even coverage of UV light, which is important for this to work. Lastly, I cover the tray in cling film and leave it outside in direct sunlight. Combination of the heat and the UV light from the sun causes a chemical reaction which draws the discoloration out of yellow plastics and returns them to nearer their original colour. It doesn't prevent the same thing happening again over time in the future, but it does make things look a lot better, in my view anyway. 4 hours later, and it was looking a lot better when compared to the 3.5-inch bay cover, which I definitely didn't forget to put out at the same time. With all the cleaning done, there was nothing left to do but put everything back together. I decided to move some of the built-in I/O to the press outs in the back of the case rather than using the PCI slot covers. This has the advantage of freeing up the PCI slots for later use if I wish. The VGA, parallel and 9-pin serial connectors all went on with no issues, but I then realised that the PS2 connector for the mouse would foul on the motherboard and AT connector for the keyboard, so that and the 25-pin serial connector stayed on this rear I/O bracket. Next, the CPU got a new dollop of thermal paste before the cooler went back on and made its way back into the case. Then I connected up all of the rear I/O to the various headers on the board. Things were a little tight here, and I ended up having to shuffle things around to get everything fitting nicely. In terms of expansion cards, I decided I didn't need to include the modem, USB card or PCI sound card. On a machine of this vintage, I don't really have need for USB or a modem, and I couldn't find drivers for the Intex card, so I didn't fancy my chances of getting it working. In its place, I'm going to install this Sound Blaster All64 in the ISA slot instead. I know it's an earlier vintage than the rest of the system, but it comes with excellent driver support under DOS and Windows 98, which is probably what this machine will end up running most of the time. I kept the Ethernet card installed as I may well connect this to my retro LAN to share files back and forth. With everything shoehorned back into the case, it was time to look at those drives. The original beige CD drive didn't look in too bad a condition. I gave it a strip down and clean and everything looked healthy, but when I put it back together and connected it to a power supply, it was just completely dead. This DVD drive is a slightly later vintage, but it matches well aesthetically with the dead drive, so I'll put it in its place. I decided not to include the black drive in the build as it really messed up with the aesthetic, so in its place I've installed this removable hard disk system. Not only does this deal with the empty slot, but it also means I can change out hard disk much easier on this machine, which is good because I plan on trying out a variety of different OSs across multiple IDE disks. Lastly, the floppy drive got a good clean and went back in. I don't foresee I'll use it much for transferring files, but it might as well go back in. I'll probably add a Gotek to this machine at a later date for the odd occasion where I do need to use a floppy image. Before I could refit the front panel, I needed to reinstall the reset buttons and power and hard disk LEDs. The button just clipped in place, but the LEDs needed to be re-hot glued in place, which I managed to do without burning myself for once. With that done, the front cover went back on, and then the shroud was refitted on this late 90s bad boy, and it's back in one piece. To give the machine some character, I added a TME domed badge for the front, along with Windows, Intel and Creative reproduction badges courtesy of Geekenspiel. I also added this Y2K badge to the top to cover up some biro marks that I just could not shift no matter what I scrubbed it with. I don't know who Vinay is, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't want his phone number in the hands of some random nerd who spends way too much time fixing old PCs. The monitor got a similar clean to the PC to remove the old netcracker stickers. This was even more of a pain than the PC itself, as I really didn't want to dismantle it, and it would have been a terrible idea to throw an assembled monitor in the bath. After a lot of elbow grease and various chemicals, I managed to get all of the sticker remnants off without too much damage, even though the finish is a bit patchy. So, let's see how it looks with some period correct accessories. I hope you'd agree that it looks a lot better than when I found it. The front panel has cleaned up really nicely, and luckily there was no real damage to speak of underneath the stickers. The retro brighting has worked really well, with only the faintest shade of difference between where the stickers were and where they weren't. So, nothing left to do but power it on. For this trial run, I installed Windows 98 SE as it seemed to match the age of the system the best. After a bit of hassle trying to sort out driver issues for the VIA chipset, everything was working great, but then disaster struck. I didn't catch it on film, but the PC crashed and then just wouldn't power back on. The power button activated the PSU, but the system just would not post. After taking the motherboard back out, I noticed that several of the capacitors did actually have dome tops, which I hadn't seen before. This seemed to be all of the 1000 microfarad 10 volt caps. To be safe, I set about replacing all the caps on the board. Luckily, here in India we have electronicscomp.com, which sell capacitors really cheaply, so it only cost me the equivalent of about $7 to recap the entire board. I noticed during the recap that a number of the capacitors had definitely been replaced previously, so it looks like this machine has been well loved for most of its life. After finishing the recap, I reinstalled the motherboard and thankfully the machine sprang back into life. Nothing to do now but test it with some games. And yeah, here's where this PC's main problem shines through. A lack of 3D acceleration means that many games that are age appropriate for the system just won't run on this machine. We're basically limited to games which have a software rendering mode like Unreal Tournament or the terrible PC port of Metal Gear Solid. You can push this further to later titles like UT 2003, but at that point the software rendering modes just look terrible, and you would never choose to play games like this. That said, it handles earlier DOS and Windows titles with ease. And if I could just lay my hands on an interesting period-correct 3D accelerator, this could be a formidable machine. If only I could remember why I ordered this sticker. I hope you've enjoyed this restoration. If you have, please consider giving this video a like and maybe subscribing to see more of my videos. I'd love to read what you think of this project and any comments you may have, so drop those down below and I'll try and get back to you. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.